Welcome back to the quiet work, the work that fills our hands while our minds wander elsewhere. Today, while the work gets done, we're talking about voices that have been drifting through the air for decades. Voices that anyone could hear, but almost nobody could understand. Imagine it's 2 in the morning, the house is quiet, most of the world has gone to bed. You're sitting in front of a shortwave radio, slowly turning a dial through bursts of static. Voices drift in and out, a news broadcast from somewhere overseas, a fragment of music, then another pocket of noise. And then a woman begins speaking. Not to you, just speaking. Her voice is clear, almost detached, as she reads a sequence of numbers. 5, 8, 3, 1, 7. A pause follows, then another sequence, then another. The transmission lasts several minutes before disappearing back into the static. For most people, that would be the end of it, an odd thing heard late at night and forgotten by morning. But for decades, people all over the world kept finding these broadcasts. Radio hobbyists logged frequencies in notebooks, they exchanged recordings through clubs and newsletters. Some listeners became familiar enough with certain stations that they could recognize them within seconds of tuning in. One might begin with a short melody. Another used a woman's voice speaking German. A different station relied on a mechanical voice that sounded as though it had been assembled from spare parts. Nobody seemed willing to explain what these transmissions were for. That silence became part of the fascination. The broadcasts weren't hidden. Anyone with the right equipment could hear them. They appeared on published frequencies, often at predictable times, yet they existed in a strange space between public and private. Thousands of people could listen, only a handful were ever meant to understand. The name number station eventually emerged simply because nobody had a better one. It wasn't an official term, it was a label created by listeners trying to describe something that had no obvious category. And while the broadcasts varied from station to station, the basic formula remained surprisingly consistent: a voice, a sequence, then silence. Some stations remained active for years, others vanished without warning. A frequency that had been reliable for months might suddenly go quiet and never return. For radio enthusiasts, tracking them became a hobby all on its own. The appeal wasn't necessarily that they were frightening, it was that they felt unfinished, like stumbling across a conversation in the middle and never learning who was speaking or why. Every transmission hinted at a larger story that remained just out of reach. As recordings accumulated through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, one thing became increasingly clear. They weren't random broadcasts. Someone was sending these messages. The only question was, who were they meant for? The funny thing is, number stations weren't uncovered by intelligence agencies. They were uncovered by people with way too much free time and a fascination with radio. In short, it was a bunch of nerds. And I mean that as a compliment. If you've never messed around with the shortwave radio, it's a little hard to explain why so many people fell in love with it. Today, if you want information, you pull out your phone. If you want music, it's a tap away. If you want to talk to somebody on the other side of the planet, you can do it while standing in line at the grocery store. Things weren't always that connected. For a lot of people, radio was how the wider world arrived in their homes. Shortwave radio was especially interesting because it didn't really respect distance the way people expected it to. Under the right conditions, signals could travel thousands of miles by bouncing through the atmosphere. A person sitting alone in a spare bedroom might hear a broadcast from another continent without ever leaving their chair. Part of the fun was not knowing what you would find. You'd turn the dial and see what was out there. Maybe you'd get a news broadcast, maybe some music, maybe some languages that you've never heard before. And every now and then, something would stop you turning the dial any further. That's how many people first encountered number stations. Not through headlines or government reports, but simply by accident. A listener would stumble across a voice reading groups of numbers and move on with their evening. Then a few days later, they'd find another one. Maybe it sounded different, maybe it was a different language. But the basic idea was familiar enough that people started to pay attention to it. As more hobbyists compared notes, a picture began to emerge. These weren't isolated broadcasts. They were part of something larger. Listeners began to keep logs, and the frequencies were written down. Broadcast times were recorded, and the recordings were traded between enthusiasts who were trying to figure out what exactly they were listening to. Some stations became so recognizable that listeners began to give them names. One of the most famous was known as the Lincolnshire Poacher. Before the numbers began on this station, it would play a few bars from an old English folk song. For many listeners, hearing that melody was enough to know exactly what frequency they had just landed on.
Three, 9, 7, 1, 5. 3, 9, 7, 1, 5. 3, 9, 7, 1, 5. 3, 9, 7, 1, 5.
Another station became known as Swedish Rhapsody. This one earned a reputation because the broadcast sounded as though they were being read by a child. Whether it was actually a child is still debated, but the recordings have a way of sticking with people long after they've heard them. There were dozens of stations like these. Some remained active for years. Others seemed to vanish overnight. A frequency that had been reliable for months might suddenly go silent and never come back. At some point, the hobbyists began to notice the pattern. The broadcasts weren't drifting through the air by accident. Whoever operated them was committed to keeping them running. Transmitters needed maintenance, equipment failed, frequencies changed, schedules had to be tracked. That's a lot of work to support a broadcast that never identified itself and never tried to attract an audience. Most radio stations want listeners. They seemed content with being found by accident, and that's why it stuck in people's minds. Everyone could hear them, but nobody could explain them. The stations occupied a strange middle ground. They weren't hidden, but they weren't exactly public either. If you stumbled onto one, you were clearly hearing a message. You just weren't the intended recipient. For years, that unanswered question followed these broadcasts around. Who was speaking? Who were they talking to? And why go through all this effort just to read groups of numbers over the radio? Eventually, people would arrive at an explanation. Not all at once, and not because some government stepped forward and explained things. The answer emerged slowly, piece by piece, from intelligence investigations, declassified information, and a growing understanding of how espionage actually worked during the Cold War. As it turns out, the numbers themselves were never the interesting part. The interesting part was who could understand what those numbers meant. This is where eventually every conversation on the topic would end up. Who were the messages for? People had a lot of theories. Some of them made sense. Some sounded like something you'd hear from a guy 3 beers deep at a campground. The problem was, nobody really knew, and honestly, I get why people would become obsessed with it. If you've got a mystery sitting right in front of you and you can literally tune in from your own house, it's hard to not start pulling onto that thread. At first, most attention focused on the stations themselves. Where were they transmitting from? Who owned the equipment? Could the signal be traced? People spent years chasing those questions. Eventually, though, attention shifted towards the numbers. Because maybe the voice wasn't the important part. Maybe the station wasn't the important part either. Maybe the important part was that somebody, somewhere, clearly understood what was being said. That realization changed how people started to look at the broadcasts. The numbers sounded random to everyone listening. That didn't necessarily mean they were random, it just meant that the audience was missing something. The more researchers looked into it, the more one explanation kept resurfacing. Espionage, spy networks, intelligence agencies. Now, I'll be honest, that sounds like the kind of answer people jump to when they don't have a better one. If somebody finds a mysterious briefcase, it's spies. If somebody hears a strange radio signal, it's spies. It's almost become a cliche at this point. The difference here is that the idea actually fit. The Cold War was in full swing for much of the period when number stations were most active. Governments around the world were gathering information anywhere they could. Intelligence agencies recruited sources, ran operations overseas, and spent enormous amounts of time trying to learn what their rivals were doing. Information at this time had a lot of value. And if you're running an intelligence network, sooner or later, you run into a practical problem. How do you get instructions to somebody without drawing attention to them? That's where things started clicking into place. Imagine you're an agent living in another country. You don't want somebody showing up at your door every time there's a new message. You don't want a phone call. You don't want mail. Every interaction creates another opportunity for somebody to notice what's happening. A radio works differently. You can sit in your living room, listen for a few minutes, write something down, and move on with your day. Nobody watching from the outside window would know whether you were receiving instructions or listening to music. And that brings us to something called a one time pad. Don't worry, this isn't going to turn into a math lesson on us right now. The basic idea of this is pretty simple. Two people have matching code sheets. One person uses it to scramble a message, the other uses it to read it. Without that matching sheet, the message is useless. You can record it, you can study it, you can even stare at it for 20 years. You're still missing the piece that gives it meaning. And suddenly, those endless strings of numbers start making a lot more sense. The voice isn't the message. The numbers aren't the message either. They're more like a locked container. The actual message only exists for the person holding the key. What I find interesting is how simple the whole thing is. When people think about espionage, you always tend to think about fancy gadgets, hidden cameras, briefcases handcuffed to wrists, all that sort of stuff. But some of the most effective ideas are surprisingly boring. A radio, a notebook, a list of numbers. That's it. For years, the espionage explanation remained exactly that, the explanation. A good one, but still a theory. Then, evidence began to surface. Investigations into real intelligence operations uncovered communications linked to the number stations. The most widely discussed examples involved Cuban intelligence networks, where encrypted messages were connected to broadcasts that hobbyists had been recording for years. For a lot of researchers, that was the moment the picture finally came into focus. Not every station was identified, not every mystery was solved, but the larger question finally had an answer. People weren't overhearing random broadcasts, they were overhearing instructions. Messages intended for a very specific audience. And the strange thing is, the system worked extremely well for decades. That turns into another question, however. The Cold War ended a long time ago. So, why are some of these stations still on the air? By the late 1980s, the world was changing. The Cold War had shaped so much of the 20th century and was beginning to wind down. Within a few years, the Berlin Wall would fall. Governments would change, alliances would shift. Entire political systems that had seemed permanent suddenly looked a lot less permanent. For a lot of people, it felt like the beginning of a new era. And in many ways, it was. Technology moved fast, computers became more common, the internet arrived, communication became easier, faster, more accessible than anything previous generations even imagined. However, some number stations stayed on the air. Not all of them. Quite a few disappeared. Frequencies that had been active for years went silent, familiar voices stopped transmitting. Some stations just vanished off the airwaves. But others remained. And I think that's one of the parts that gets overlooked. The espionage angle tends to get all the attention. People hear spy station and immediately latch onto that as part of the story. I get it, it's interesting. But what fascinates me is that these broadcasts managed to survive the technological revolution that followed. Think about how much communication changed in just a couple of decades. Suddenly you had email, cell phones, encrypted digital communications, satellite networks. The world became connected in ways that would have sounded like science fiction to someone listening to those radios back in the 1950s. Yet, every so often, somebody turning a dial would still stumble across a voice reading numbers. When I first learned about that, I assumed there had to be some mistake somewhere. Surely this was old information. Maybe people were talking about recordings from years ago. Maybe the stations that people were hearing weren't the same ones, but new ones that had popped up. But no, Some were still active, which raises yet another question. Why? Why continue using a technology that seems so outdated? The answer is pretty simple. Old tools survive because they're still useful. A hammer is old technology, so is a shovel. New inventions have come along that make things far easier than those two tools, and yet we still use them. Comes down to that old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And for certain kinds of communications, shortwave radio still has advantages. That signal can travel enormous distances, and you only need basic equipment. Most importantly, the person receiving the message doesn't have to announce their presence, they just have to tune in. That doesn't sound overly remarkable, but in a world where almost everything leaves a digital footprint, there's something unusual about a system that asks so little from the person on the receiving end. There's no accounts, logins, subscriptions, anything. Just a radio and the knowledge of where to tune into. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean modern intelligence agencies are using every number station people hear today. The truth is, we don't know. That's one of the frustrating things about this whole topic. There are pieces that fit together nicely, there are pieces that remain stubbornly out of reach. Some stations have been linked to governments, others we're still uncertain what they were used for. And a few seem to still generate far more questions than answers. For radio enthusiasts, that certainly has become part of the appeal. There are still people who track these broadcasts, they're still sharing recordings. They're still doing all the same things that hobbyists were doing 50 years ago, trying to understand what exactly they're hearing. And every once in a while, a familiar signal will still appear. A voice emerges from the static, the numbers begin, and somewhere, somebody probably knows exactly what it means. The rest of us are left doing what people have always done when faced with a mystery, listening a little longer than we had planned to. You know, the number stations aren't exactly new to myself. I've heard about them many times, I've listened to the creepy recordings, and yet, every time I hear about them, I'll start going back down the rabbit hole. And it's not because of all the fancy spy stuff that everyone likes to talk about with them. For me, it's just how simple all of this was. It's just a voice reading numbers, it's not dramatic, there's no explosions and car chases, no secret underground base in a volcano. It's just somebody talking, and somewhere else, somebody's listening. I don't know why, but there's just something so interesting about that. Maybe it's because we spend so much time imagining history has all these huge events wars, governments, presidents, entire countries making decisions that affect millions of people. Then you look at something like a number station and realize that eventually, all that gets reduced down to a single person sitting in a room. Maybe they're in an apartment, maybe they're in a car, maybe they're at their kitchen table just listening to the radio. Nobody around them has any idea what's happening. To everyone else, it would just be a completely normal evening. Every time I go down this rabbit hole, I always end up thinking about the person listening to the message more than the agencies actually running the programs. Is it literally just some guy sitting there with a notebook listening to it? Do they understand the message immediately, or did it take them a long time to translate? We'll probably never know, and honestly, that's fine. Not every story needs every question answered. Sometimes it's enough to know that it happened. Somewhere, for decades, people sent messages into the air, and other people waited to receive them. None of us were ever meant to understand those conversations. We were only close enough to overhear them. And maybe that's why number stations continue to fascinate people and myself. Not because they're impossible to explain, but they're a reminder that even when we think we understand the world, there are still conversations happening around us that have absolutely nothing to do with us. We're just passing by, catching a few words, and wondering about the rest. Anyway, that's enough radio talk for one day. The work's about done, and somewhere out there, a voice is probably still counting.